Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am, of course, your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. To learn more about the Parthenon Podcast Network, the history of the papacy, Beyond the Big Screen podcast, and how to support and keep the History of the Papacy podcast an ongoing affair for long in the future, please head over to the website a2zhistorypage.com. Did I mention we are on Patreon at patreon.com/history of the papacy, and that is a great way to support the show. There's 4 tiers: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome, each with their own unique rewards, including the most important benefit being on the History of the Papacy diptychs. And let us commemorate the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Today we are joined one more time, at least for now, by Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow in Scotland to wrap up this whole series on the history of the early church in Ireland and the British Isles. The Synod of Whitby really marks the logical place to set our bookmark on the history of Christianity in the British Isles. Don't worry, we'll be back to this area in future episodes and series. But for today, the Synod of Whitby was really the event where a number of threads of the story of the church in early Britain all come together. Computus, monastic practices, and the various family issues that King Oswiu of Northumbria had were at least partially settled at this synod. Let's find out how. And with that, I present the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. We've talked about Columba and Columbanus. Who are some of the other big names we should keep our eyes on?
Yeah, so there's so many saints that you can have a look at. There's Adovnan, who is the author of the Life of St. Columba. He's a saint in his own right, and he wrote a number of things. There's, of course, Bede. There's Malachy of Armagh that I am, of course, interested in because he spent time as abbot at Bangor as well. There's trying to think, names have just flown right out of my head. There's Saint Brendan, who most people will know of as Brendan the Navigator. There's Canach. There's more saints than you could shake a stick at, as we like to say where I grew up.
Oswald, he was the king of Bernicia and Deira. Was that a Celtic land?
No, so that is going to be Saxon kingdoms. We would know them more generally as Northumbria.
But there would have been a certain amount of crossover because it was so far north.
Yeah, so there would be crossover. We've got these different kind of kingdoms that are pushing against each other. And so they're going to have conflicts. They're going to have intermarriages. There's going to be power fluctuations in the area. And the thing about Oswald is that he and his brother Oswiu had spent time in Dalriada or maybe in Ireland as well. When they were in exile, their side of the family had kind of been overthrown from the throne, and so they had to go into exile. So they were educated in this kind of Gallic or Gaelic church situation. And so when Oswald regained the throne, he asked Iona to provide a bishop for not only himself, but also to help with the conversion process for his kingdom. And it was St. Ivan, who he then gave land to at Lindisfarne to found a monastery there. So although this was a Northumbrian kingdom, we're seeing this Iona or this Irish brand of Christianity being the one that's brought in. And you'll even see when Bede talks about the conversion of Northumbria, he is very positive and effusive about the Irish. It's almost that the Irish can't do anything wrong even when they are doing things wrong, versus the way he talks about the British church. He's taking part of it from Gildas, who thinks that everyone is terrible all the time. But he's also upset that the Welsh, or the British, or Welsh, if you want to call them that, didn't engage in the conversion of the Northumbrians or of the Saxons. But we can wonder, to what degree you would want to be part of the conversion process of your enemy if the Saxons had come to conquer your lands. Like, are you going to turn around and be like, hey, let's talk about Jesus? So we've got all of that going on.
Oswald is a Saxon king in an Anglo-Saxon area that has Celtic in it, but he asks Iona to bring a bishop, Aidan, or you pronounced it Ivan?
Ivan, yeah.
Ivan, who presumably is Celtic, to set up the Lindisfarne in Northumbria. What kind of flavor does that give the Lindisfarne monastery when it's getting set up as far as theology goes?
Yeah, so we would really consider that kind of this Irish style monastery. They would look to Iona for a lot of information and support. And so we could consider it very closely kind of, I don't want to say allied, but I'll say it anyway, allied to Iona and of a mind with it, if you like. And this will change very starkly after the Synod of Whitby. And that's when we see it change to this Northumbrian or this more Roman style, because they decide, or Oswiu really decides to, we're going to go with this calculation that Rome is going with, even though Rome had recently changed which calculation they were going with. And you don't see that mentioned in Bede. You don't see that mentioned in the life of Columbanus. You don't see that mentioned in the life of Wilfrid. They're not going, oh, hey, by the way, Rome just recently changed. They're kind of smoothing all of that over to make it seem like Rome was, of the same position the whole time.
That's really interesting. One question I have, when is Bede writing in comparison to these events that we're talking about?
Yeah, so Bede was alive at this time. So he knew Wilfrid personally. As far as his specific dates, let me have a quick think. So, yeah, he would have been like late 7th towards not quite mid 8th century. But yeah, he is said to have known Adamnan personally, and Adamnan is said to have gone down to visit with him. So yeah, he's talking about a lot of events as far as the Easter controversy goes that he'll have been really close to. So this isn't the case of writing 100 years later or 200 years later.
And through Bede's writing, do we see him, is he leaning more towards the Roman position or more towards the Irish position, given that he was a Lindisfarne guy?
So he wasn't a Lindisfarne guy. He was born near the monastery of Yarrow. And so...
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's Northumbrian, and he is firmly on the Northumbrian side as far as this goes. So he's very, we are properly Orthodox and we're following the way of Rome. And so, yeah, it's obvious where his kind of proclivities lie, if you like. And yeah, he likes the Irish, but he is like, oh, well, even when they're wrong, they're still trying really hard to be right. So we should still like them. But
before we move any too much further, maybe we excuse me, maybe tell us a little bit about Wilfrid.
Yeah, Wilfrid. So Wilfrid has his own life that survives, which I think is fantastic, but he was kind of he caused a lot of drama in his life. So he was born in Northumbria, and it was Wilfrid that had joined the community at Lindisfarne. And so he had kind of befriended King Oswiu's wife, and King Oswiu's wife had come from Kent. So she had a more clearly Saxon religious upbringing, and so she was using a different calculation of Easter than Oswiu would have been. So Wilfrid, we're told he journeys to Rome to learn the laws of ecclesiastical discipline. His hagiographer Stephen, I think, is going to some great pains to lay some foundation of his impeccable Orthodox credentials. So we're told that he goes to Rome, that he is taught by Boniface the archdeacon, including this rule about Easter, which Stephen makes sure to explain that the British and Irish schismatics were ignorant of it, so that way Wilfrid can kind of bring this back to Britain and especially to Northumbria and be like, this is the correct way, you should do it. So he gets really close in with Oswiu's family, and so he gets chosen at this Synod of Whitby to kind of speak in defense of this Roman calculation of Easter. But he gets ejected from different positions that he holds throughout his life, and he refuses to get his ordination as bishop from Celtic bishops. So he wants to go to the continent to get them so they're quote unquote Orthodox enough. And he's just, I find that I think of him as somebody who would be really annoying to know in real life, because he would just be all about it all the time.
Actually, this is not somebody who's going to have a chat with you over a cup of coffee. He's going to tell you how it is.
Yeah, that's the sense that I get from everything that I've read about him is, people probably weren't fence sitters as to how they felt about Wilfrid.
Then we have, I guess, how do we get to Whitby then? What are all the forces that bring all these people and all these ideas and all these monastic houses to Whitby?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this synod really seems to have been called by Oswiu. So he's got these competing calculations of Easter going on in his kingdom, and even more than that, in his own household. We might say in his own bedroom. So his wife is using a different calculation of Easter from him. And so that means sometimes on days when he's meant to be feasting, she's meant to be fasting. And if we're thinking even just about this period of Lent, if he's ending his Lent, so he's starting his Lent before his wife is. So he's having extra long Lent in his household, which means extra long, refraining from, shall we say, marital activities. And it's affecting, the food that's meant to be on the table in his dining room. This is maybe getting more than a man can bear, you might think. So he decides to call this synod and go, right, we're going to decide, we can't have this. And there are broader discussions of the importance of church unity that are going on in the wider discussions of the Easter controversy. We see that with Columbanus, we see it with Bede, so we see it quite a bit. And we know that religious unity is something that's important to the church. We get it at this micro scale here with Oswiu and his wife.
And now a word from our sponsors. Do you do you know just off the top of your head, like how big of a swing would it have been between Oswiu's and his wife's Easter? And because it does change. It
could be really big difference. I can't remember the name of the fast that it was possible that she would be observing at the same time that he was meant to be observing a feast. I didn't write down the names for them to remember them specifically, but I know that it could be a significant difference. And if you've already gone 40 days of your Lent, and even if your wife just has another 10, like that's still significant.
And it's such a big deal too. And the Christian calendar, that's the big deal. It's Christmas is nice, but the whole thing really comes down to Easter. And
right.
If you're both celebrating it at a different time, that's going to cause some issues beyond just the fasting, the feasting. There's a lot of stuff going on with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of religious observances. And, my mind goes to what are the costs involved in celebrating two Easters? So you've got, these masses that are going to be said, and are you making religious donations to churches that you are patron of at this time? Are you decorating the church specially? What's the cost involved in that? So even outside of these important theological issues that they would have been, dealing with, I'm thinking in the very practical terms of that's got to be expensive.
Yeah, I think you can't ignore how big of a deal. It's probably a much bigger deal than what we could really ever imagine.
Yeah, and even today, people who celebrate Easter get all dressed up, and it is a big and important to do. And so if you're having to do that at a different time than your spouse, that would be a really kind of jarring experience, I might think. And, this discussion of religious unity, I think, becomes quite important when you think about that.
And then all the ancillary people, kids, are they doing double Easters, or are they doing mom's Easter or dad's Easter? Or, in court, who are all the people in court supposed to follow?
Right.
It really, when you really start thinking about it, it's a very big deal. Where is Whitby, and what kind of flavor did Whitby have, and why would they pick Whitby of any place where they could have done this?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question. Whitby was a monastery founded in 657 as a double monastery. So it would have had men and women who were in orders there. And it was founded by King Oswiu himself, and it was located on the coast of Northumbria. So it was chosen because it was a place kind of near and dear to Oswiu's heart, if you like. He had installed Hild as the abbess of the monastery, and so that seemed to be a good place to kind of have this synod and get down to business and decide what they were going to do about this Easter controversy.
Of the big names that we talked about, who were the ones who were actually at the council or the synod?
Yeah, so I know that Coleman was the one who spoke on the part of the Celtic Easter, and that Wilfrid was the one who got chosen to speak on behalf of the Roman Easter. But there would have been more people there, and even Wilfrid wasn't considered the main important guy to be speaking on behalf of the Roman Easter. He was just considered to be more adept at the language to do so.
Was Oswiu, was he being straight, you might say, with this? Did he want it to really get hammered out amongst the participants and the best side win? Or did he have an agenda of how he envisioned the council or synod to wind up?
I get the sense from what I've read just that he just really wanted it to be decided one way or the other. And if you think that this is something that's affected the royal chamber, then I could see him just going like, I don't care what it is, just we're going to decide, we're going to do it that way, and this is going to be done. So I don't get the sense that he really was leaning one way or the other. And we might expect even that if he was raised and acculturated to this Irish style of Christianity, that he might have had a soft spot for it. But, we've got his queen having her own Saxon form of Christianity, and Wilfrid was kind of one of her favorites who spoke up on the other side. So who knows, maybe there was a sense of happy wife, happy life in his mind when he was making this decision. But I think the important thing is that in the end, it is Oswiu that makes the decision. It's not the religious men themselves. Like, this was a synod to decide what the political unit of Northumbria was going to do. It wasn't deciding theology of the church. And so I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, that Oswiu made this decision himself based on hearing the arguments of both of these sides.
Oh, so that really is, that's a lot different than if we think of the Council of Nicaea or Constantinople, that it was really the church presented the churchmen and the bishops presented what they had come out of the council with to the emperor. In this case, the king is sitting in judgment of what's going on.
Yeah, so I think that's, there were synods that happened in Ireland, frequently, and that were more in the style of synods that we think of when we think of synods. But this one really seems to be about, getting Northumbria back on the same path altogether.
From this synod, do we get from that time period acts of the synod or canons or any documentation that often will come out of a synod?
Not that I'm familiar with. I think most of what we get comes out of what Bede tells us and what the Life of St. Wilfrid tells us.
So what was the ultimate outcome of the council?
Yeah, the ultimate outcome was that Oswiu decided that, because Rome is the seat of Peter and Paul, that they were going to go with what Rome did. And so they said, we're going to do this Roman Easter, or this Dionysian Easter, we might call it. And that's what's going to be the way it is in Northumbria. And so that kind of spurs a number of these Irish monks to leave Lindisfarne. And we refer to it in my field as the expulsion of the monks of Lindisfarne. But Bede talks about it as far as Coleman decided to go. And so I'm not quite sure exactly whether it was an expulsion or whether it was a, we're not going to stand for this, we're just going to go home kind of situation. But in any respect, a number of monks leave. And so that's where we see this much more, Northumbrian or Saxon type Lindisfarne coming into play from what had previously been a very Irish or Celtic style Lindisfarne.
What is the aftermath of the council? Or synod. I don't know why I keep calling it a council. I guess you can use those fairly much interchangeably, right?
Well, and I think that really because it was Oswiu making the final decision, that it almost feels more like a council than a synod. So really the outcome of it was that Northumbria becomes reunited on its calculation of Easter. These monks that don't want to do that calculation of Easter go back to Iona. Adovnan ultimately comes down and visits Northumbria, and we're told he gets convinced as to changing over to this Dionysian calculation of Easter, but that he can't convince Iona, and they don't change to the new calculation until after Adovnan dies. But we are told that he goes to Ireland and helps to convince some of the Northern Irish to switch over, and some of them seem to before Iona does. But really, that's kind of the result, is Northumbria is back unified in their calculation of Easter, and that's really what Oswiu wanted. So
it seems to me that you first blush, if you just hear about the Synod of Whitby, it seems like it's this England versus the Ireland and the Gaelic people, but it's a lot more complicated, and it's really not England versus anybody. It's North Ireland trying to get back and more connected into what the rest of England is doing, which is in getting connected back to what is more going on in the continent. And then it's not really the Celtic people as such against the English. It's because they're kind of all over the place with their calculation as well.
Yeah, I think it's much more complicated than you tend to get the sense of when you run across it in popular culture, because, as you said, it tends to be pitted as this, the Orthodox Roman Church, like everybody's together under one banner, versus the Irish who are all together under one banner, when that's not true at all. And really, there were 3 banners going on anyway. So,
did they hammer out the tonsure issue as well at that synod?
Not really that I've seen. I mean, the idea is just, hey, if we're going to do the things the Roman way, we're going to do the things the Roman way. But there's no big, nobody can have this Irish tonsure anymore moment that I've run across. I think it probably just kind of fizzled out.
How long did it take for the Irish and Iona to move over to the Roman position on the Computus?
Yeah, so Iona would have done would have changed over about 716. So we're looking from 664 was the Synod of Whitby, but we're told that Adovnan comes down to Northumbria and learns about this calculation of Easter. So that'll be later, because Adovnan died just after 700. So that probably would have been in the later 7th century that he would have come down to do that. So yeah, it's right around that 8th century time period. And 8th century is also when we see Gaul move to this Dionysian calculation of Easter. So we're getting more kind of unity happening across the board into this 8th century period. But as you said towards the beginning, like there's still so much kind of disunity if you want to look at the entirety of Christianity.
Was the Irish are eventually pushed out of Northumbria. Was that an aftermath of this council, or was it sort of its own evolution?
I think that was a result of the Synod of Whitby, but the question that I'm not 100% sure on yet is whether it was an expulsion, so you have to go, or if it was a choice to leave. And that's the thing that I'm still grappling with, because I could see it going either way. But as far as I've seen in the evidence so far, I'm not sure which it would have been.
What were some changes in Iona that happened as a result of this time period?
So we'll have, of course, the change of the calculation of Easter, but I'm not sure that really would have had huge knock-on effects for other things. We're getting close to the period where Scandinavian raiders start coming and disrupting things in new and terrifying kinds of ways, but not absolutely new ways, because raiding and stuff was a thing that existed in kind of Gaelic culture before the Scandinavians came. So I'm not sure that I would see the Synod of Whitby as having a big impact on Iona and its culture, aside from this specific thing of how they calculate Easter.
You brought up an issue in our discussions and our notes of Necton, the king of the Picts. How does he fit into this equation?
So he's mentioned by Bede, and he talks about the Picts kind of being in this incorrect calculation of Easter, and he kind of figures into this as a political situation for these kings to decide what they're going to do. But aside from Bede making this mention, I don't see him having a big part in this Easter controversy. And there's still a lot that we don't really know about the Pictish Church. We found the site of Port Mahomet, which I think is fantastic, but we don't really have a lot of records to be able to know kind of what they were thinking in this time period.
And now a word from our sponsors. We've reached the end of this series, and you have been more than generous with your time. I mean, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. What are some of your thoughts you've really given us a master's class on Irish history. What do you think that the interested layperson should take from this adventure we've taken over the course of many hours and episodes of talking about Christianity in Britain?
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is that, the history of Celtic peoples in general is so much broader and so much deeper than we're told in popular history. And I think that it does it a disservice, the kind of boxes that it's confined to in popular history. So, it doesn't really get to the real story, which is so much more complicated than what we've been led to believe. And that it's so worth, taking the effort and digging into finding out just how broad and amazing and astonishing these histories can be. And that the medieval church in Ireland, we tend to think of it as this kind of backwater, out of the way, unorthodox, unlearned place, because that's what has come through in popular history. But really kind of the opposite is true. It was a center of learning that was recognized both in Britain and on the continent. And I know that I mentioned already that Irish clerics began to migrate to places like modern day France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany. There's even a term that was used in German for the Irish monks that came to Germany. They were kind of discussed as a community. I can't remember the term off the top of my head. Of course not. But yeah, they were really known and respected for their capability and their level of education. So that's something that I really want to come through in what I say, that this is complicated and fascinating and way deeper than that surface level that we get through popular culture.
Who are some of the people at the end of the day, after we've talked about so many different characters, who are some of the big names that people should keep in their mind? And if they wanted to do further reading, they could look up.
Yeah, so there's, of course, Adovnan, who I've mentioned, Columba, there's Bede, the Venerable Bede, there's Columbanus, there's Malachy, there's, do more work on Patrick. He's interesting as well. There's St. Brendan. So there's so many people, but those are some good names that you can really kind of sink your teeth into.
Place is another thing it was such a big deal. And what we talked about, what are some of the places that people might look at and maybe even visit one day?
Yeah. So as far as these places are, I've kind of stuck to a list that is in this early medieval period. So there's places like Cashel that become really important in the high Middle Ages, but I was sticking to things that were kind of pre the year 1000. So my recommendation is to have a look at Armagh. That's really closely tied to Patrick. You've got Kells, Kildare. So Kildare will be tied to St. Bridget, and definitely have a look at her, because when you've got Armagh trying to claim the prime episcopal seat of Ireland, one of the main counter places is Kildare through their association with St. Bridget. So that's also really interesting to look at. There's Lismore in Ireland, and that kind of ties in with St. Malachy. He spends some time down there, and you get mention of it in the life of St. Malachy, which you can go read. And then looking more into Scotland, some places that you can do some reading on, that there already exists some good accessible scholarship, is, of course, Iona, and then also Tiree. And then you can look at Dunfermline is a good place to do some reading in. But again, I'm generally trying to keep my list to the earlier sites. There's Dunkeld, that's also associated with Columba as well, along with Kells in Ireland. So those are some good places to kind of get stuck in that will probably get you even further stuck in and more details.
It was interesting. I was looking at the Book of Kells. You had suggested that, and you can look at it online, of a really high quality, high def images of it. Is Jesus sitting on his throne in the front cover? Does he have a big blonde hair, or is that something I'm not looking at correctly?
That is an excellent question. I haven't looked at the Book of Kells much lately. Let me take a quick look here. Yeah, I see it looks like the evangelists are probably there in the side panels. I'm not sure if that's specifically meant to be Jesus, but that is interesting. Oh no, it does say Christ enthroned, so that's meant to be Jesus there. Yeah, as this blonde-headed guy. And there's some questions that we can ask maybe of even this early period. We've got this idea of this white European Jesus. And so if we're seeing him as early as this Book of Kells time period, how far back does this, Europeanization, that's not a word, Europeanizing of Jesus go? And what does that tell us? This is still an issue that we've run into today, of this idea of the white Jesus and what he actually would have been as a Middle Eastern Jew, not being a white guy. But here in the Book of Kells, we've got him displayed as this very light-skinned, blonde-haired person. So that there's probably whole conversations that could happen just on this racialization aspect of making Jesus a white guy.
Yeah, it made me just start thinking that when that book was written, okay, yeah, maybe the people who did the artistry on that, the graphics, you might say, of the Book of Kells, maybe they didn't really know, and they're just imagining it of what they know. They know there's a lot of blonde people around, draw it this way. But then you would think like you maybe get some of these Syrians who had come into, and they're like, well, wait a minute, I don't think that's how he looked exactly. And you start to ask those questions. Was he being Europeanized or Irishized, you might say? Or was it that the artist just doesn't know? Because then you start looking at the art and iconography of Jesus and the other people, Middle Eastern people. It just starts to evolve every step you take. And you look at Ethiopian art, and all of the Jesus and the other people are kind of looking more Ethiopian and Asian if you start going in the other directions. And I think that's so fascinating to try and to me, that one was so glaring because Jesus had such big blonde hair in that picture. But then isn't his beard brown?
Yes, his beard is brown. Yeah. And I think a question of, there definitely were, we'll say, people of color or people with darker colored skin who would have been in Britain and Ireland at this time, that would have come during Roman times as well. There was connections, and so there was movement of people. So while that was a thing that existed, we might not think that the extent of new incomers coming into these places wasn't going to be the same across the entire geographic region. So they may have been more in the port areas or in Britain in the cities. So I'm sure there were plenty of people who would not have come into personal contact with them, even though they were there. And that's something that we should and really have to acknowledge, especially in the face of things that we've talked about for white supremacy that are ongoing in our present, that people of color were there and were around and are properly associated with these times and places. But yeah, Irish monks would have known about Leo Africanus, and the desert fathers they know were in Africa, and Alexandria being one of the important places. There would be knowledge there, but how that might come through in their art is a thing that I know there's been some work on it, but it's not an area that's within my wheelhouse, so I'm not super familiar with it. But these are things I think it's important to acknowledge and to bring to light when we're talking about them.
Yeah, that's definitely a really fascinating topic. And I think our last thing here is, what are maybe some books that a person could get their hands on? But what are maybe some, at least semi-accessible books that people could get their hands on to learn more?
Yeah, so the ones that I've listed for today, I think are good, accessible books. If you don't really know anything about the time or the place, these are fine to get your hands on. So there's Davio Cronin. He has the early medieval Ireland, 400 to 1200. Thomas Charles Edwards has early Christian Ireland. James Fraser has from Caledonia to Pickland, so that's going to be more in the modern Scotland area. Gilbert Marcus has Conceiving a Nation, which is also Scotland. And then Alice Blackwell has Scotland in early medieval Europe, which I included on the list just because it kind of goes back into where they are in Europe and gives us some of that broader picture of kind of continental interactions with this insular world.
Well, I just want to thank you so much again for this. Is so much more comprehensive than I could have ever imagined that we would be able to do an entire series with an expert. So I just want to thank you so much for presenting this to us and answering our questions and, just everything.
Yeah, it's been really enjoyable. And what we thought was originally maybe going to be just one episode has turned into so much more. And I've loved being part of it. And I love getting to share this with people because I'm passionate about it. And I tell people that I give miniature medieval history lectures all the time. So it's nice to be able to harness some of that to a more directed purpose, shall we say.
This is the end of this series, but I definitely hope this isn't the last time we hear from you. You're always welcome on the show. And anytime you have something you'd like to share, you are more than welcome to come on.
Well, I appreciate that. And I already have some things buzzing in my brain. So we'll see what goes on from here. But yeah, I'd love to be somebody available to the show for future questions or things of that nature.